going all the way back to Aristotle, classic, rhetorician philosophy. Ethos, logos, pathos were the three methods classically of persuasion. One's credibility was ethos, one's use of logic was logos, one's implementation of emotion was pathos. And they were a toolkit that you would use as a rhetorician to get persuasion.
It's like sales, right?
I think right now, due to the environment we're in this rush to get content to market, to get attention, we're relying more on pathos. And a generation has been groomed to expect pathos to be the attention-grabbing mechanism of choice and the mode of persuasion of choice. So logos and ethos have a very hard time competing in that environment, and we could discuss how that's impacting.
Well, I want to ask you
and
about that.
TV.
So you said that the audience has been groomed to prefer pathos. Is that what you think has really happened, or is it a matter of popular taste that people want what's emotional and what appeals to
I would make
those
the
instincts?
case that in an attention-starved economy, where you're hyper-competing for people's attention, pathos works because it's shorthand. Logos requires too much attention. And we're living in an environment where a whole power dynamic is being revised.
Testimony, in effect, is supposed to be testimony that can be tested. And what has happened today, clearly, is that format doesn't really play in the media business. And reality, by the way, the only real reality is a sport that's not fixed. That's a real reality, because you don't really know what the end is going to be, and you're watching it to see where you're going to get there. As we know, most of it is scripted. So for me, when I see documentaries, and I use that term in a loose way, when I see a film that doesn't show both sides, for me, that bothers me. I always think if you're going to put something on that is a, quote, documentary, you should give both sides and let the audience make a decision.
I was a documentarian, and at the same time, I was a newsman. So I covered politics. I felt that you needed to see different sides. The first full-length documentary, it was 60 minutes, that was a long film at the time, was about a Los Angeles poet named Charles Bukowski. And Bukowski, if those of you know him, was a very unique, very controversial, very interesting character who he created his own myth with his writing. I'm a drunk, I'm a womanizer, I'm a reprobate, I'm all these different things. And he literally, he admitted, he fed those things. He did those things to feed his muse so he could write about them. But the thing that was interesting to me, and again, he let me into his life. He became a very good friend. But I said, I'm going to try to just get under the skin here. The way I did it was because with him, he was too good. He was fantastic. He was a poet. He knew words. He could handle himself in front of the camera. I went to the two women in his life, and he had two different relationships he went back and forth with. An older woman and a young fallen Mormon sculptress who was fiery. And the thing that was fascinating in this instance was to hear him say, I did this, and I felt this, and so forth, and then talk to the women and going, no, he's not like that. They slept with him. They knew him. And in that instance, there was balance. Now, you could say that's journalistic.
Sounds like a documentary.
Well, it could be, exactly. But the point is that I felt, maybe it's because I was also a journalist, I felt that I didn't want to just hear Charles Bukowski's point of view of himself, because he was skilled and he was brilliant and he was fascinating to see. But there was another side, and if people will only talk about themselves in a particular way, you need to come around a different way and understand what they won't tell you. And those two women did. The broadcast network demands that there's a fairness doctrine, that you do kind of show both sides. And so therefore, with these entities, and this is the complication we are in today, because traditional entities, in my time when I was a broadcast journalist, you had to make sure it was fair. In today's world, because of the internet, Because someone can go on the internet, and we see it all the time, and say whatever they want. They don't have to back it up with sources. They don't have to prove that what they say is true. They just do it. And don't think that that hasn't had an effect on journalism in this country.
I think the Supreme Court is wrong on both levels. Defamation and the fact that it doesn't apply to deceased is from another world, another country in the 1800s. So it doesn't really
Earlier.
apply in 2019. So in my opinion, the law should be changed.
Carrie, you wanted to add
Yeah,
something?
I guess I'm thinking many things. I mean, the case of Michael Jackson is such a unique case. He's such a unique figure. He's almost incomparable in any other situation. So it kind of sends shivers up my spine to hear that we would change the law based on this particular instance, given who he is in the world. The idea that we as journalists, as filmmakers, couldn't do investigative stories about people who were deceased just seems to me a real assault to the First Amendment.
But you're not
what
talking about
about
investigative stories.
No, but what about doing something on Nixon? What about doing? I'm just saying generally. I'm not saying that the film is fair or not. I'm just saying, but to really try to shut down our ability to do that would be putting us in grave danger democratically, I think.
Maybe it
Not
shouldn't be. I'm
not
sorry.
suggesting that you can't do the story. It's just to be accountable for some relation to the facts.
By the way, if you knowingly defame somebody, sorry, which is what I think the question you were asking was,
That's what you would have to prove.
false
Correct.
and malicious, then you should pay the price, whether a living person or a dead person.
What can you say? Because it may be true, but you are tainted. And the moment you are tainted, it's over.
Yeah,
So
life-altering.
it's a pretty tough world at this point that we're in. It's exactly like you're a communist. You attended a meeting. Well, I attended a meeting, but I'm not a communist. Doesn't matter. You're going to lose your job. You're going to be finished in the professional world. That's where we find ourselves today. And frankly, I don't know. I don't think the problem is you could present someone denying it, but as I said, once accused, you're accused, and you are therefore, quote, guilty in the public opinion.
At Frontline, what we've done is we've started what we call a transparency project. We're putting our interviews, the whole interviews, unedited, up on the website. Not for every project, but for many of them. And I think there are lots of news organizations that are now spending a lot of time trying to be as transparent and put as much information about their stories and the background and their sourcing as possible. Now, not every news organization is doing it as well as Frontline is or as they're promising to do. There's a lot of talk about not using anonymous sources anymore for exactly this reason. But I think that's pretty clearly a consensus in the group, is that more transparency and disclosure is maybe the single most important thing that we can expect as an audience for all of these media, whether it's documentaries, newspapers, television, whatever it may be, because then you can make your own judgments. I mean, that was Howard's point, I think, from the very beginning, and I think he's dead on about that.
I'm thinking, obviously, of Leaving Neverland, where the point of view is presented as fact. But there's no other side to it. In fact, the director of that documentary said I had no interest in talking to anybody else. So I would challenge you to name one media outlet where if you went to your boss and said, I don't feel like talking to anybody who has any fact or opinion that might shoot down my theory, that film, that article never get written, never get made. So I found it interesting that HBO, they didn't have journalists come to the screening, they had movie reviewers. And if this had been presented as a movie and an opinion, fine. If they had presented both sides, like you would require in a courtroom, the courtroom requires both sides. So something like Leaving Neverland is the one side. In a courtroom, you get to get the other side, and then you get to make a decision. That didn't happen here. As I understand it, and you're an expert on it, and I'm not, part of the reason for the First Amendment is to get at the truth. The lack of defamation protection for a deceased person doesn't get at the truth. It does not serve that purpose. So what I would suggest is there's no reason why defamation should not extend beyond somebody's life, at least for children and grandchildren who are affected emotionally and financially by things like these allegations in Leaving Neverland. Copyright law is life plus 75. Defamation might be life plus 20, 30, 40. You know, there is some way to set it up so the deceased can be protected. I mean, now we're about to listen to stories about Martin Luther King. I mean, starting in the 80s, James Baldwin had the famous quote that Michael Jackson would forever pay the price for being as successful as he was and buying the Beatles catalog. The press started on Michael in the mid-80s, and it hasn't stopped. And you asked the question, why not do a counter documentary? It's impossible to prove a negative. And quite frankly, there are a large segment of the press that doesn't care because it's not controversial.
So interestingly,
Just my opinion.
isn't that what you'd have to prove in a libel case? Wouldn't you have to prove the negative if you brought a defamation case on behalf of the estate?
Funny you should mention that, because when Michael was alive, there was an allegation by Victor Gutierrez. And it's interesting that the Robson Safechuck allegations are patterned right after Victor Gutierrez. And you know what happened? Michael sued him, won. The man suffered a several $1 million judgment, went bankrupt, and left the country. That's the difference between what HBO did and what happened when Michael was alive. Professor Dershowitz opined in an interesting article that if Michael were alive, HBO's lawyers would never have allowed them to do this documentary, at least in its current form, because they would have been required to at least offer some balance.
You posed a question earlier. What do you do when somebody makes an allegation and the other side is not responding or is not able to respond, right? So there's two things you do. The first thing you do is you investigate. And Leaving Neverland did not investigate because there are massive, glaring factual inaccuracies in that documentary. It's full of them. That you've got a kid saying he was molested in 1988, 89 in a building that was not built until 1995.
James, I
right?
don't want to interrupt you too much, but we're going to run out of time, and I
Yeah, okay.
don't think I can have you go through the whole laundry list.
No.
right now.
I'm not going to list everything, right? But
Okay.
it is teeming with errors, right? Massive errors. So then what do? If you've not investigated, you go to the other side for balance. They didn't do that either, right? And the filmmaker gave a ridiculous excuse of, I included Michael Jackson's denials from when he was alive, except he never denied these allegations because these guys never accused him until he was dead. You have lawyers who've been litigating with these guys for 5 years